Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
You're right, no human being would stack books like this.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we're looking forward to today's interview with former atheist turned Christian, Holly Ordway. Holly Ordway is the Cardinal Francis George Fellow of Faith and Culture for the Word on Fire Institute. You can find that at wordonfire.institute. She's also the visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. That's formerly Houston Baptist University. You can find that at hc.edu. Her writing, speaking, and teaching focuses on imaginative and literary apologetics and on the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. Oh yeah. For my previous interview with Holly, detailing her journey from atheism to Christianity and about literary apologetics, you'll have to scroll through the podcast feed prior to the numbers of the reboot episodes or check the link in the show notes. That was like 2012, so I don't know how that sounds. Check it out if you're interested for more. Now, Chad, I'm excited about this one because Holly's got a number of great books, but we've just recently read Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach to defending the faith. And we'll talk about some of her other books in a minute, but any thoughts on the book?
Yeah, I really appreciated the book, and I love the aspect of before somebody can accept something through their reason, their imagination has to be sparked. And many times that has to happen for someone to grasp it. I also appreciated how she discussed the relationship between reason and emotions and how one can err if they are too much of the emotions or too much of the reason and how those things should work in harmony. And of course, I love the tying in of so much Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I never get tired of reading that. And it actually made me want to kind of dig into Lewis's writings more. So I read Lewis when I first got saved, but I haven't read a lot of Lewis since. And it's actually made me want to revisit some of his works. And so I'm looking forward to talking to her and just seeing how this can encourage people to think about, maybe rethink would be a better way of saying it, how they present the gospel to help people to not only be moved by arguments, but also moved in an emotional way and how those two things work in harmony. How about you? What did you think?
Yeah, I also enjoyed the different aspects she brought out about the differences between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, both bringing their Christian worldview into their writings with intention, what great impact they had by doing that. I also like the aspects about, one of the things she said was you can't believe something that you don't understand, and grabbing someone's imagination as a way to introduce and illuminate concepts that can bridge the gap to understanding. So
right.
Let's talk a little bit about some of her other books real quick.
Sure.
Some of her books include Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, and Not God's Type, An Atheist Academic Lays Down Her Arms. That's sort of her journey from atheism to Christianity and how literature played a significant role in that. And of course, we'll be talking about apologetics and the Christian imagination today, but she's got a whole lot of writings, including poetry and various contributions to other books and chapters and essays and things. You can find all those in the show notes or go directly to hollyordway.com/writing. And of course, check out the book we're discussing today, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach to defending the faith. So let's get right to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right, Holly Ordway, thanks for joining us for the podcast.
My pleasure.
We're talking with you today about your 2017 book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach to defending the faith. And we've enjoyed it quite a bit, but I think it might help people to know your background and how imagination sort of opened the door to Christianity for you.
Well, the whole topic of imaginative apologetics, has a root, really a spark, you might say, in my own experience of coming to the faith, because I am an adult convert to Christianity. Very, very briefly, I was raised in a completely non-religious home, not anti-Christian, but just non-Christian. I didn't know anything about anything. And in fact, I think it might be fair to say that I was the only child in America, perhaps the entire world, who grew up reading the Chronicles of Narnia, but did not know that Aslan is Jesus. So I grew up really not religious at all. And then when I went to college, I first was sort of generally agnostic and then ended up drifting into a really firm, conviction of atheism. And this was not really an emotional atheism. It was an intellectual atheism. I had no reason to believe that Christianity was true. And what little I had seen of arguments for Christianity were all sort of emotionally based and completely implausible, especially the appeal of, become a Christian, then everything, will be perfect and life will be rosy. And obviously that's simply not true. That's simply not the case. So I was not a believer, but at the same time, in sort of a parallel track in my experience, I had grown up loving The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. I'd grown up loving The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Really fundamental elements of my imaginative world, and really compelled by the beauty and just the meaningfulness of these worlds. And of course, these authors are deeply Christian. And I didn't know that when I was first reading them. Then I discovered that they were Christians and sort of was a little bit upset by that, but then thought, well, yes, but I can just ignore that because I love their books so much. Did my PhD in English literature centered on fantasy literature and writing about Tolkien, and really exploring in particular his great essay on fairy stories, which indeed has a proclamation of the gospel in it, quite a powerful one. And it moved me quite deeply, although I didn't properly understand what he was saying and didn't know why I was responding that way, and didn't want to be a Christian, didn't believe it, but thought, this is really moving. So fast forward a little bit, I was doing my first teaching, my first full-time teaching, and teaching, great poets who also happen to be great Christians, John Donne, Gerard Manley Hopkins. And the sort of cumulative effect of all of this was that I started to recognize a kind of cognitive dissonance, that on the one hand, everything that I consciously thought about Christianity was that Christians are stupid, weak, infantile, irrational, etc. And yet, here we have Lewis and Tolkien and T.S. Eliot and John Donne and Gerard Manley Hopkins, and the list goes on, who are clearly not stupid. These are brilliant thinkers, brilliant writers, and the worlds that they're presenting are so beautiful and so moving that it was hard to accept that they were the products of people who were superstitious and ignorant. And so that prompted me to say, well, I really want to find out what it is that these people believed so that I can understand their work better and appreciate them better. Didn't want to become a Christian, didn't think I was going to become a Christian, but went into it with a pretty open mind, which would not have been the case 10 years earlier when I was just still dismissing all of it. Went into it with an open mind because I had been so compelled by the stories and the beauty of the language that these authors were producing. And then, to make a long story short, I realized, oh, good heavens, it's actually true. I've got to become a Christian. What have I done? And then I, as you obviously know, became a Christian. But really that movement of the imagination first awaking interest in the mode of thought, the mode of seeing the world through Christian eyes was absolutely fundamental to my being interested in what they believed. And that has really become the cornerstone of my work in Imaginative Apologetics, this really fundamental concept that we don't care whether something is true or false unless we find the concept meaningful. And the creation of meaning is the function of the imagination.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I wonder maybe if you could unpack a little bit more, what do you mean by imagination and what role does it play as far as in the context of your book?
Well, this is a really important question because most people, when they hear the word imagination, they tend to think of imaginary because the imagination can create imaginary scenarios. That's what, for instance, novelists do. But then it tends to make people think that therefore it's sort of an optional extra. Well, sure, you can read novels if you want to, but you don't need to. You don't. So they tend to think of the imagination as just sort of frivolous and, for entertainment value. But in fact, the imagination is a fundamental human faculty. And that's something that goes all the way back to the medieval thinkers, medieval Christians thinking through what is the role of the imagination. And essentially, and this is something that I unpack in Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, the imagination has a critical role in the meaning-making process because we have our senses that bring us data, sight, sound, etc. And then we have our judgment, our reason that interprets the data. But there's something that happens in between because simply raw data doesn't mean anything. It has to be assimilated into a meaningful image. And we can see this, for instance, in those clever pictures that if you look at it one way, it's a duck and the other way, it's a rabbit. It's the data is lines on the page, but there's a faculty in our minds that has to assimilate that into a meaningful pattern. They're not just random squiggles. It's a duck. No, wait, it's a rabbit. And when you look at one of those pictures, what you're seeing is the imagination functioning as that meaning-making faculty right in real time. And then your reason can make a judgment. Is it a rabbit? Is it a duck? Oh no, it's a clever picture that's both. And so the imagination is that mediating factor. Until it does its work, the reason has nothing to operate upon. It can make no judgments because it doesn't have anything except noise, meaningless jumble. And once the reason makes its judgment, true, false, then the will can act. Do I want to do something about this? Does this matter? Do I need to take action? And this function of the imagination is so innate, it's so constant that we usually don't notice it happening, but it's absolutely fundamental to every aspect of human life. And it's absolutely essential to our religious understanding, because if you take something like, say, the existence of God, to take a quite important argument, until the word God has some meaning, we don't even care whether it's true or false. It's just a word. It's just a religious jargon word. Who cares? It's just an abstract term. Or we might have faulty meaning for it. And this is the case, with a lot of people today. Their meaning for God is, old man in the sky who's going to blast me if I do something that's on his bad list. Well, that's a false meaning, but it's a meaning that has been constructed.
In a way, what culture is doing right now is using their imagination against Christianity. Like you talk about the man in the sky who's got a lightning bolt. That's already been appealing to their imagination. And so this is their concept. So whereas if you're reading something like this Silmarillion or something like that, you have this plausibility structure that's been created by, oh yeah, I can see how God could create the world and how there could be angels and powers and how it all makes sense within this system. And so you've created a concept where you can have a good God where evil is allowed and used, for instance.
Yeah, and that's a great example because we all have to construct meaning for our concepts. This is inescapable. It's not handed to us on a platter. We all have to be constructing it. But what are we constructing it out of? And are we feeding our imaginations with images that help us to grasp the correct meaning? And you're absolutely right. Tolkien in the Silmarillion, he's building this fantasy world of Middle Earth, but he is very clear in all of his letters, all of his writings, that the God of Middle Earth is the God. It is the one God, the God of our own actual planet. And so therefore, everything that Eru Ilúvatar does in the Silmarillion is consistent with the way that God operates. And so therefore, when we're reading, say, The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, we are taking in meaning that is consistent with a true understanding of who God is. And it's helping to build up the right meaning, as opposed to other things we might read or watch or hear that contribute to a faulty meaning.
One of the things that you're touching on here today that I thought was really great in your book was that excellent chapter on meaning. And you kind of make that point that as apologists, we have to really combat the distortion of meaning. How does this impact the skeptic's view of Christianity, and how can the church begin to kind of address this change of meaning, this distortion of meaning, and language being kind of dumbed down?
Yeah, again, this is such an important question, such a big one. And I think, it's not just a question of things being dumbed down, although that is certainly a part of it. Things being made simplistic, which is different from making things simple and understandable, but also just meanings being twisted. And perhaps my favorite example is just favorite in a sort of a bad way, is the word sin and sinful. It is very difficult to use that word authentically in discourse with anybody who isn't a really, really well-educated, well-catechized Christian. Because even a lot of Christians have a very faulty view of what sin is. Why has this come about? Well, some of it is, active rejection of the idea of anything being wrong. But a lot of it has just been a sort of cultural erosion of the word and a replacement with other meanings. I mean, this was brought home very vividly when I went into a grocery store one time and I saw a sign of a display of chocolate cakes and it said sinfully delicious. And I thought to myself, exactly what sin are they talking about? Are they lying about the ingredients? Are they encouraging gluttony? Are they selling them without having paid the wages of the people in the store? I mean, obviously that's not the case. What sinfully delicious meant was just, it's really delicious. And so sinful has just become, in ordinary average usage, a word that means you're going to feel a little self-indulgent, but it's fine. And indeed, it is perfectly fine to have a slice of chocolate cake under normal circumstances, unless you're overdoing it, unless you have stolen it from somebody, etc. But when we talk then about real sin, we have to realize that the people we're talking to have a meaning that has almost certainly been distorted by the trivialization of it. So they hear us talking about, certain sexual behaviors as being sinful, and they hear and understand, oh, it's lots of fun, but we Christians don't want to let you do that. That's not what we mean.
One thing in talking about the relationship of imagination and reason, you emphasize that reason is dependent on imagination. There's a relationship there. I wonder, could you unpack how that is foundational? The imagination aspect is foundational.
Well, first, I will point your listeners to a really excellent piece by my friend and colleague, Michael Ward. He's written a fantastic chapter called The Good Serves the Better and Both the Best, C.S. Lewis on Imagination and Reason. And it's from Michael's explication of this concept that I gained this insight. This comes back to the meaning-making quality of the imagination. The reason has to have something to work on. Until we have a meaningful image, we simply have nothing to work with. And that's why the imagination is fundamental, because the reason can only make these judgments if we have something to act upon. So, for instance, if I want to decide, whether God exists or not, the reason is only going to be starting to consider arguments for the existence of God or not if I have a concept of God that is even coherent, that is even plausible, that has any significance for me. Otherwise, I'm just going to not even think about it because I have nothing to grasp hold of.
Throughout the book, you intersperse it with great snippets of poetry. It inspired me to go and look up some of these poems. I'm like, oh, J.R.R. Manley Hopkins, he wrote this one poem I liked. I didn't know it was by him. The world is filled with the grandeur of God. And I love that poem. In a way, poetry to me doesn't make sense. It makes me feel. And because the arrangement of the words is not made to give you propositions, it's made to sort of elicit feelings and emotions and images and beauty and sadness. And so it's almost like language is being used, but propositions are not, and you're not trying to logic anyone into anything, but a picture is painted. And I happened to be watching something about Japanese paintbrushes and how they were being made and the years that they go into making these for the calligraphy. And they were talking about just the intricacy and the detail for these calligraphers to make these Japanese symbols. And I said to my daughter, it must be that the stroke pressure and the texture carries some sort of meaning, and they have to convey that. And that's why it's so important for those brushes to be just so precise down to the millimeter. And that's conveying something that through words or symbols that is more than just a proposition. So I say all that to say, what are the limitations of language? And why, as apologists, should we take that into account so that we're not just throwing around premises?
This is so important. I mean, this is really at the heart of my work in imaginative apologetics, and as a poet myself. As there are poems of my own in apologetics and the Christian imagination. And it occurred to me as I was writing this book, I was writing a largely propositional exposition of why the imagination is important in apologetics, and then I realized that my form was starting to undercut my argument because I was arguing for the importance of imagination in a purely propositional manner. This is not working. And that at that point, I started to intersperse, to end each chapter with one of my own poems that that reflects in some way on the theme of the chapter. And of course, as you noted, bringing in, Hopkins and other poets and authors, because language, as you note, Brian, quite rightly, has great value for making propositional arguments. And this is important. But we are not just logical beings. We're not Mr. Spock, although even Mr. Spock had emotions. He just hid them very well. We are not just floating brains. We're not pure intellect. We are incarnate. And this is at the heart of Christianity, that we are incarnate beings. We are body and soul. We are not souls that just happen to have a body. We are body and soul. Our bodies matter. We're going to have new bodies at the resurrection. And so part of being embodied means that we experience the world in an embodied way, not just conceptually. And we have emotions that relate to our wills and our reason. They're not independent of them. They all, interact. And pointing to a great book by C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man, and I will point out, again, my colleague Michael Ward's wonderful book, After Humanity, which is a guide to Lewis's Abolition of Man, where he unpacks that argument very well. Lewis talks about that the head needs to rule the belly through the chest. The belly is the source of the emotions. The head is the intellect. The chest is where you have that sort of vital feeling, that integration. So the head needs to rule, but it rules through the heart, through the seat of the emotions, through the chest, and gives us a sort of integrated life, put it that way. So coming back to this idea of language, the point is that if we just use propositional language, we're speaking only to the head, and we're not taking into account our fullness as embodied incarnate beings, and we're going to go wrong. And we're also not going to capture the truth fully, because you could say it's, it's 50 degrees out right now. And that will mean something different if you're looking at centigrade versus Fahrenheit, for one thing. But it won't tell you what it feels like to go out and feel the sun on, I'm talking Fahrenheit, the sun on your skin, and the freshness of the earth after the rain, and the sight of the tulip bulb starting to come up. All of these things are more than just a propositional statement. It is spring. It is 50 degrees out. So literature can do a lot to help us to get a more complete picture. It can tell us, it can give the texture of things. It can tell us things that a pure propositional statement can't. But propositional statements can do things that more literary statements can't either. It's a both and. That's really the key limitation of language in general, is that all language has also its limitations, because I can evoke what it is like in springtime. But if you want to really know it, you've got to go outside. So that's a fundamental limitation of language. Essentially, you do have to just live it.
The approach you suggest in the book, I think, addresses that problem that you talk about of the compartmentalization, right? That whether someone knowingly or not, they put up a wall so that only mind or only the emotions can, hear the gospel, as you put it, as opposed to the whole self. And you would argue that this imaginative approach would help snap somebody out of that?
It helps. And I think it's important to note, as you've just pointed out, that you can compartmentalize in lots of ways. You can become all intellect and just become focused on philosophical and theological arguments and never really get into, what does it mean to love my neighbor? How is my prayer life? What is God doing in my whole life? But you can also compartmentalize your emotions and just focus on, how do I feel, and not think about, are my feelings rooted in truth? Am I really on the right track here? And we can even get compartmentalized simply on the will and say, I'm going to do the things that Jesus said to do. Never mind anything else. I'm just going to do this checklist of things. Well, that's not going to work either. Our Lord said some things about that approach with the Pharisees. It doesn't work. So the imagination, it's not a panacea. You can also go wrong with your imagination and just focus so much on, how am I experiencing this? What does it mean to me? And never really do anything, and never let it translate into action. But the imagination, when it's cultivated rightly, can really help to pull together the imagination, the emotions, the intellect, the will. All of that can come together, and then it tends to help to break down those compartments and allow kind of more space for the Holy Spirit to work. Because none of this is our doing. The imagination is simply another gift from God, and He is the one who does all the work. but we can prepare the ground and sort of try not to have so many barriers up so that when he does come in to do the work, that it will take effect more fully.
Yeah, you do mention in the book that the imaginative approach can't stand all by itself. It has to be coupled with argument, and I think that you're sort of demonstrating that. And I hope maybe by asking this next question, we can sort of show what that looks like in practice by comparing Lewis and Tolkien. They both used this approach in their literature and writings, the way they communicated, but was different though. So can you talk maybe about their differences and how they achieved it, even though they weren't doing it exactly the same way?
Yeah, and it's beautiful that we have this comparison because they're both absolutely great authors. They're both absolutely great Christians, sincere, devout lovers of our Lord. And so they help us to see there isn't just one recipe for how to do this. Lewis did a lot of arguments. Interestingly, even in things that we often think of as being more philosophical or theological, like mere Christianity, if you look at it in depth, you really see how much he's using image and metaphor and narrative within it. He's just using it so deftly that we don't notice. But he also goes into more, purely philosophical works like The Abolition of Man. And that's something that Tolkien never does. And then in the Chronicles of Narnia, even within the narrative approach, Lewis is a bit more overt. He wants us to see that Aslan is a figure of Jesus. It's not an allegory. But we see it's a supposal. He says, suppose Jesus was incarnate in another world, and so we are supposed to look at Aslan and see Jesus and draw those conclusions. And that wasn't how Tolkien operated. Tolkien never did overt, direct, written theology. Closest he comes is some bits of On Fairy Stories, where he does very beautifully talk about the way that we are creators because we're made in the image of the creator. But that's a small section of On Fairy Stories. Mostly in his stories, he's writing these works that are infused with his faith because he himself is so well rooted in the faith. But he has deliberately removed overt references. He says this. He says about Lord of the Rings. He says, I quote, "It is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing, but consciously in the revision. And that is why," he says, "I cut out all the overt references to religion." You think, wait, didn't he just reverse that? He consciously made it more religious by removing any really overt references to religion in The Lord of the Rings, because he wanted it to be, as he put it, in the symbolism of the story. And that's what he wanted to do. It's under the radar, and it works. It's part of why I became a Christian, because it's so powerfully under the surface, and so therefore you're compelled by it before you even have a chance to reject it. And then you think, oh wow, this is really moving. This is really beautiful. So we have an instance there of the more overt and direct with Lewis and the more subtle with Tolkien, and they're both brilliant.
As I read your book, and I have read Tolkien and Lewis, I found myself thinking about this approach that you propose in the book. I think makes a lot of sense, and I think it's needed. And I like how you talk about how it's not really a new approach. It's kind of a return to an older approach, which you do a great job demonstrating. But someone like me, I wonder what you would say to someone like me who I address arguments. I am very much that like premises, reason kind of approach. And I want to grasp this. I want to be able to apply it to my own writing, to my own apologetics, but it doesn't come naturally. It doesn't come. What would you say to someone like me to kind of, get me rolling in that direction so that I can develop these skills? I mean, I'm certainly not suggesting that I could get to the level of you or the people we've been talking about, but how can I add more imagination into the way I present the gospel to help bridge the gap that people have?
Well, I would first say, congratulations, you've taken the first step just by wanting to do this, just by being attentive. And that's so important because our arguments are made stronger when we have that imaginative element. I mean, philosophical arguments are hugely important. They're really, really valuable. And part of why I think it's so important to have an imaginative approach is precisely so that these arguments will have the effect that they ought to have and that they won't just be, flying over people's heads. So one thing I would say is, C.S. Lewis kind of offers a masterclass in this. If you read, for instance, Mere Christianity, but read it with a very particular frame. Look for how he says the things he says. Look at all of his images. He'll say something, and then he will give you a metaphor. He'll give you an image. I mean, there are dozens of them in Mere Christianity, and you can see how it works if you pay attention. I mean, he was exceptionally gifted at this. And so it's not a question of, I can then imitate him that way. But you can start to see the way that, my own understanding of his argument is enhanced by the way that he's using these analogies. And then it allows you to start thinking, okay, well, what analogy would help me to put forward this idea? Another thing that can be helpful is to start thinking about who is my listener, who is my audience, and what is the meaning that they have for the important terms in this argument. It's I think I talk about theory of mind a little bit in the book, and that's kind of the reverse. If you're thinking about how do I use more images in my own presentations, the next step is to say, okay, what is my interlocutor bringing into the conversation? And that's so important because people bring very different things, and the kinds of images that you use to relate to them are going to be and should be different based on what they're coming to you with. So, for instance, if someone is having trouble with the concept of God the Father, well, why? What is it about the idea of fatherhood of God that is difficult for them? Before we launch into an explanation of, God the Father, the Holy Trinity, etc., maybe we want to ask some questions and say, what does the word father mean to you? Oh, you were abandoned as a child. Oh, you had an abusive stepfather. Oh, okay. Well, the word father for you is caught up with a lot of really toxic and painful things that are genuinely distorting your view by no fault of your own. So that person, you might say, okay, well, perhaps we're not going to start with the fatherhood of God. Perhaps we will start with like the mercy of God or the love of God or something like that. We'll just go someplace different and eventually arrive at the point where we can say, God the Father gives us a picture of what true fatherhood is supposed to be like, and you didn't get that. But if we try to say at the beginning, no, God's a loving father. You should love God like as you love your father. Oh, my father who molested me. Oh, really? So I think that exercise of theory of mind can really unlock the imaginative element. Now, it takes more time, and it means you have to be really focused on our audience. But that, again, I think is good for us spiritually as apologists, because it is, and I speak of myself as well. I preach to myself in this. It is very easy to try to just have one answer and say, well, I'm just going to tell you, and then you should know. But we need to be able to speak to the individual, to that person's needs and to that person's context. Or to give another really important answer, if someone asks, why does God permit suffering? Well, there are some really, really great philosophical arguments for that. But first we want to find out, what's the meaning of this question? Are they a 17-year-old college student who is really grappling with philosophy and is just intrigued and is trying to make a logical sense of it? Or are they somebody who their little sister has just got diagnosed with leukemia and is dying in the hospital? Which approach? With the curious philosophical studies college student, we might go right into the idea of free will. With the one whose little sister's in the hospital, we might say, let's look at Christ on the cross and his suffering and how he is suffering for us. Very different approaches based on what they're coming to us with.
Thank you. It's helpful.
Holly, when you were talking there about the ways that C.S. Lewis used metaphors and things, it made me think of Jesus and his parables and how those caused emotional reactions and memorable stories that people would easily be able to pass on and think about the images and the meanings and such. Would that be sort of an example scripturally of what you're talking about then?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I was hoping that you would bring this up because that's really the biblical warrant for imaginative apologetics, is that our Lord does it. And he is the best, obviously. But just objectively speaking, you can see it. You can see the power of these parables. I mean, look at the parable of the prodigal son. You can say, God loves you and he'll forgive you if you repent your sins and return to him. Okay, great. Propositional statement. True. How much meaning does it have? And then we have this fantastic little short story, essentially, of the prodigal son who runs away, wastes his inheritance. He's looking at the food the pigs are eating, and he's hankering after that. I mean, that's such a powerful image. And he's coming home, and he's rehearsing the speech in his mind. Okay, this is what I'm going to say. I'm really sorry. And his father comes running out to meet him and embraces him. I mean, that is so vivid. That conveys the meaning of the father's love. I mean, if you can picture what it would be like to get in that position of the son trudging home, wretched and humiliated, and his father running out and embracing him and, you know, putting the robe on him and bringing him in to give him a party. Wow, that's what repentance and forgiveness means. And that's something you cannot get from the simple statement. But once you've gotten it, then the statement is significant, and you can think about the statement and you can build on it intellectually.
Yeah, that's great. So we've been talking about imaginative apologetics, and highly enjoyable, but there's something else I'm really looking forward to, and that is your forthcoming book, which is now available on pre-order. Please tell all of our listeners about it, because the pre-orders, they're going to flow in. So talk a little bit more about your book, Tolkien's Faith.
Right. Well, this is Tolkien's Faith, a spiritual biography, and it is what it says in the tin, as they say. So it's a spiritual biography of Tolkien, and it traces basically his religious development, his spiritual development, all the way from his childhood through his adulthood. And it's seeking to understand how his religious life was shaped, and therefore how it influences his writings. And it was such a fascinating study to do, because first of all, there has been no study of his faith. You would think there had been, but there has not been. And there's been studies of his works, but not of his own personal faith. And it turns out that he had a very dynamic life as a Christian. You know, his mother converted to Catholicism, which ended up with the family then being in poverty because the extended family just cut her off without a penny. And so then she dies young. And so he's raised as the guardian of a Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan. And he goes through the trauma of the Great War. He fights in the First World War. As he says, most of his friends were killed in the war. And he goes on and ends up being a professor at Oxford. All of this we know. But these points, these struggles and difficulties in his life were all places where he had the opportunity to turn away from his faith, as so many of his compatriots did. He could have turned away as a young man. He could have turned away after the trauma of the Great War, but he didn't. He had struggles. He had a period in which he, as he himself says, he almost ceased to practice his religion, but then he renews it. And in part, he renews it through his friendship with C.S. Lewis, who he helped to become a Christian. So throughout his whole life, there's a real story of drama and difficulty. It's not an easy life of faith for him, but he digs into it. He embraces it, and he puts his roots down very deeply in it. And I think this helps us to understand better how in his works he can have this beautiful expression of both suffering and joy, because he's really lived that in his own faith. It's not just something he accepted comfortably and moved on with his life. It's something that really mattered to him at great cost, in fact. So this is what I explore in the book. I found it really interesting to write, so I hope people will find it interesting to read. It's coming out in August 2023, just in time for the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death.
Wow. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, I can't imagine. I've always heard people say, oh, well, Tolkien, didn't you know he was a Christian? And can't you see it in his works? And I thought, well, no one, yeah, you're right. Nobody's really written about this. You don't hear anything about it. So it must have been a really fascinating sort of exploration of that. So looking forward to that. And we'll definitely link to that pre-order in the show notes and point our listeners there. Where can people find more of your work? And is there anything else you'd like to point them to as we close up?
Well, the easiest place for them to find my work is on my website, hollyordway.com, which I try to keep up to date with my latest books and things. And so I also have a book that's going to be coming out next month. It's an edited volume of J.R.R. Manley Hopkins' poetry called As Kingfishers Catch Fire, selected and annotated poems of J.R.R. Manley Hopkins. And that you'll just have to wait till it comes out because it's not available for pre-order. But that Hopkins book is coming out. And then, of course, the Tolkien's Faith coming out this summer, which you can pre-order. So those are the two big things that I would point out to readers.
Now, we've got 1 minute left. And you have to explain to Chad why tea in the UK is better than tea in the USA.
That was fascinating. That made me want to try tea so badly over there. Seriously. So
this is the effect of the imagination, because my description of it has created meaning for you. And now your reason wants to test this out. See,
bingo.
This is a perfect illustration. Yes. So tea in the UK, you can make it properly in the US. I impress all my friends when they come over. Boiling water, not just hot, boiling water, proper English breakfast tea. And this is controversial. Put the milk in first, and then the tea bag, and then pour the boiling water on top of the milk and the tea.
All right. I'm writing that down.
When you're in the UK again, pop over to Northern Ireland and we'll have a cup of tea. Holly Ordway, thanks so much for joining us again. A very enjoyable book and very important and meaningful content, and looking forward to the new stuff as well. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Well, it is a pleasure as always.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.